Hi, everyone. My name is Rosada Georgievich. I'm the program coordinator of the SIBA for Health Equity program at Proceed Inc.'s National Center for Training, Support, and Technical Assistance. Our first speaker for today is Crystal Jackson. Crystal is a licensed therapist, founder, and clinical director of Simply Being Wellness Counseling. She is known for helping people to get real about self-care, and her insights have been shared with Forbes, Healthline, Yahoo, and various podcasts. Her mission is to teach people how to navigate life's ebbs and flows with compassion and intention. Her approach uses cognitive and mindfulness tools for improved mental wellness. And her favorite mantra is everything I need is already within me.
Thank you, Rosie, for the introduction, and hello to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It is a pleasure to be back again. Hopefully my sound is good. You can see and hear me great. All right, awesome. So there is a lot to cover in regards to youth mental health. I'm going to do the best that I can with the time that I have, but I do know we have some resources available, whether they be on the screen or if you need some things afterwards. I'm happy to provide some of the resources that Rosie and I have been able to come up with for this topic in particular. So my objective here is for you to walk away with having a better understanding of kind of the state of mental health with our youth in the US, but also to feel more empowered about how you can help to support our youth, recognize signs and symptoms, but also just being more understanding of how much it takes for us to model and regulate our own system when it comes to being able to help our youth with their mental health as well. So we'll talk about some of the things that are contributing to the mental health crisis in the US, interventions, advocacy efforts, helping you to understand some of the signs and symptoms. I'm going to tell you breeze through that because there is I could have a webinar for each kind of each category. So I will do my best to encompass everything that you might need to know. Recognize when youth should be connected to professional mental health services to gain confidence in engaging in meaningful conversations. And I think that's most important here is that we want to be able to normalize these conversations, to have more of that supportive and connection, because I really do see how impactful that can be, not only for our youth, but adults as well, how much that helps us to be able to feel healthy and to thrive. And also to gain some insights about how we're supporting our youth with mental health concerns and drawing from personal experiences. And so happy to share today with Mallory and Colin. We have some time to talk with them afterwards so they can share their stories. But I do have a question for you. When you think about youth mental health, what words come to mind? Sorry, my thing is very sensitive if I touch it. If somebody can help me with the chat, what's coming up?
We have a few answers here: anxious, crisis, undervalued, anxiety, overwhelming, knowing what you are feeling, communication, depressed, stigma, many times misunderstood, repression and fear.
Yeah, all of those are very, very real, and especially from both sides. So a lot of my work lately with youth has been from a crisis setting. So either I'm going out to respond to them, to the crisis, or from the emergency room. So usually when they see me, we've already had several things happen or occur, and they're in a state where they need to have a more kind of really more acute support. And sometimes parents will come and they're like, I don't know what to do. And so a lot of that of what you're describing of is the anxiousness, the being unable to understand, like, what is the right thing to do? Am I contributing to this? Am I, in some way, am I making this situation worse for them? And so I think that those are very real things. And I hope that today, by the end of this webinar, you'll come away with some things to help you feel a little bit more calm and confident about being able to move forward with how you show up for your youth. On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you in your understanding of youth mental health needs and services? And I think there's a polling, the polling question is up.
Looks like
Okay,
lots of people are leaning towards a 6 right now. Crystal, if you can see.
yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Your job is not to be an expert, even as much as in my opinion, so not an expert, right? But one thing I know is that we all at one point were a child and were a youth, and we had our own understanding in hindsight, looking back into what was going on with us that we can bring forward into our present moment. And so I would encourage you to draw from that as well to be able to connect. But also, there's so much information out here. I think it can be a challenge to understand our truth, fact from fiction, and what things we should be really paying attention to. And so hopefully that gets a little bit clearer for you after this. What we do know is that one thing that I will say is that I always tell people everyone has mental health, not everyone has a mental illness. A mental illness is something that is diagnosable, it has symptoms, and we have treatment for that. All of us have mental health, just like we have physical and spiritual health that we need to take care of. But what we know is that there are some things that will contribute and make us more at risk to have more kind of deficits or challenges. Some of those factors, whether it's positive or I like to say protective factors, things that help us to actually cultivate a healthy mental health, or risk factors, do include biological factors, our family history, our genetics, brain development, or chemistry. What we do know for certain disorders, such as like psychotic disorders, if you have a first line family member, a mother, father, a sibling that has something like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, you're 50% more likely to be able to develop that. Same thing with depression, anxiety. The numbers aren't as high, but we do know that if there's a family history or there's some genetics, it does play a part in how our brain develops, how we perceive things, how we respond to things, our ability to cope and navigate different challenges. And then we could have really good protective factors biologically, but if we have a distressing environment, that is something that can also impact our mental health, and especially for our youth whose brains are still continuing to develop. And a lot of these things may be outside of their control, such as having their basic needs being met, being able to have a safe living arrangement, understanding where the next meal is coming from, family supports, also social media. We'll get into that and how the pandemic has had a big impact on youth mental health as well. But what we do want to understand is that those positive factors or those protective factors, that helps our youth and to keep them from developing significant mental health challenges. And so we want to highlight more of those things, even if there are other factors, that risk factors that are here, we want to be able to amplify some of those protective factors or positive factors as we move throughout this. Is anybody familiar with ACEs? Let me see if I can pull my chat back up because my chat disappeared on me. Okay, some people are familiar with ACEs. Okay, awesome. Yeah. So this is a tool that we use to measure traumatic events that occur in childhood. So usually from ages 0 to 17. About 64% of adults in the US reported experiencing at least one type of adverse childhood experience. And what we know is that the more ACEs that you have experienced, the more likelihood that a mental health concern will develop, you know, later in life. And as you see, it's pretty significant where nearly 1 in 6 adults are reported experiencing 4 or more types of ACEs. So those include any type of abuse, neglect. If a family member is struggling with a family member who may have their own mental health concerns, that contributes as well. Any witness to domestic violence, separation. A lot of children have difficult times with not only if they're separated or parental separation as well can be pretty traumatic. Poverty, racism, and discrimination, violence in the community. Uh, so I do want to quickly cover, because what research shows and what we do know is that there are certain demographics that are more likely to experience more of these adverse childhood experiences. And those include people who are experiencing racism, if there's any challenges with exploring sexuality, not being accepted, being bullied for that. We know that poverty, all these things increase the likelihood that a child is going to experience one of these traumatic events. And so I think our system needs to do a better job with implementing more supportive services in our youth. I think we're working on that, but I do wish it was a little better, because I feel like we backtrack a lot. We're waiting until people are adults and then they're talking about these things, and then we're trying to help from that aspect. But if we recognize that these are things that are occurring every day for our youth in this country, then we can put in some more interventions, I believe, and that does include us being able to have more understanding of the youth that we may be as healthcare providers, practitioners, or even as our own personal, in our own personal family or network, being able to put more supports in place for them. I wish I had more time to cover more of that, because there's so much there. Okay, up to 2017 in the US with a reported mental, emotional, developmental, or behavioral disorder. So we have seen that there has been a huge increase, especially since the entry of social media and the pandemic, not only in anxiety, depression, but also in self-harm behaviors and suicide rates among our youth. And if anybody saw the Surgeon General notice, basically calling us to be more mindful of how our children are interacting with social media, because if they're spending more than 3 hours on social media, they find that there's direct connection between an increase in depression, anxiety, and even cutting behaviors. Sometimes my youth that I've dealt with in recent years, they look to social media to help to educate them on mental health challenges. And for some, they actually find harmful tools. They may learn how to engage in some harmful behaviors, such as self-harm behaviors, such as cutting or asphyxiation or things like that. Or sometimes, I think at one point, all of my youth were coming to me to tell me that they were dissociating or they're dealing with narcissists. And I'm like, wait a minute. These are clinical terms that we need to understand. Like, is this really happening? Or are we taking things from social media and applying them to ourselves inappropriately? With that being said, social media also is having an impact on how our kids are connecting. And a lot of our kids are finding social media to be able to post about their day, to see what their friends are doing, to see what things are coming up. And but also some of our kids are using it to bully other children, whether that's posting inappropriate pictures or taking in real life situations and conflict and bringing them to social media. And so we've seen a big increase in suicide as a result, because the pressure of showing up online or how people are perceiving them online, and that being taken out of context into in real life situations and vice versa, these things are having a more distressing impact on our children. So if you get a chance, please check out the Surgeon General's report, because I think it has some really great information in there. Some warning signs of mental distress is behavioral changes. So because our children's brains are still developing until well into their early 20s, a lot of times it can be difficult to have the words to say or adequately communicate what they're experiencing. So we may see changes in other ways that are highlighting to us that there's something going on. So if you notice a sudden change in the mood or behavior, if you notice that your child may be self-harming or talking about hurting themselves, maybe they're withdrawing and isolating more, changes in their academic performance, changes in their weight, their sleep, their eating pattern. if they're making any statements about feeling just more sad or crying more often or this constant worry, those may be signs that your child or teen may be experiencing anxiety, depression, or other type of mental health challenges. So we want to be mindful. And also, I'll talk about some ways of opening the conversation, because I think a lot of times us as adults, sometimes we can interpret what's happening with our kids as a misstep, as a personal attack on what we're doing or how we've been able to nurture them or take care of them. I know in my family, these were not things that was really kind of talked about. It was like, I get up and go to work every day. I push through, and I think that our family has done a really great job, at least with the next generation, of saying, okay, what is going on? I notice that you're having this change. I notice that something is happening here. Let's try to have a conversation about what's going on. There may be signs that are glaring to you, but usually these changes do happen over time unless there's a significant event that occurs, a significant traumatic event that occurs. Some of the warning signs, changes in being social, hurting oneself or talking about hurting oneself, talking more so about death or suicide. What I've learned is that kids don't talk about, they may say, hey, I want to kill myself, but usually it's, this is too much for me. I'm having a hard time. I don't want to be here anymore. It's usually more of those type of statements. And Mallory and Colin, from your experience, when we get there, you can share with me too some of the statements that we might need to look out for youth, and how they may be saying things a little bit differently than we would. Outbursts or moodiness, out of control behavior, and you'll see some other things on the screen here. These are some signs that we really have to take into account over a period of time. I'm not talking 1 or 2 days, right? Because everybody can have some crankiness and things like that. I'm talking about for a period of time, 2 or more weeks where you're seeing these changes. 50% of lifetime cases of mental illness begin at 14 years of age. And working in more acute settings, I do see that we are starting to see more cases of acute mental health concerns earlier and earlier. Children are, being placed on medications or needing to have hospitalizations earlier and earlier. And I think this is my personal and professional kind of interpretation of this, is that we don't have enough adequate services for children still. No, despite how much we've grown and what we've learned, we still need to make some headway, because our kids are suffering out here, and I think it's pretty clear that is happening. And so I have been seeing more signs of some of the disorders that we'll talk about, I believe, in the next slide. Yes. And am I good on time? I think so.
You're okay, Crystal. We have a couple minutes. I say about 5 minutes. I know you have to cover a lot of information at once, but please feel free to go ahead.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Okay. So some of the diagnoses, and these are diagnosable conditions that I'm talking about here. Not everyone will meet criteria for a diagnosable condition. Sometimes kids do show or display signs of some of these challenges, but may not be to a point where they are able to get diagnosed just yet. So if you take them to a mental health professional or your primary care physician, they can help to do screenings on much of these things to be able to assess if they're at a point where they need to have a diagnosable condition that is treated either by therapy, medication, or otherwise. So some of the common mental health challenges that we're seeing about among our youth: ADHD, depression, eating disorders, anxiety, stress management, substance use, self-harm, and suicidal thoughts. And we are seeing a big influx in these in particular. And I believe I wanna blame it on social media. I really do, as far as some of the normalization. I think as far as the self-harm and the substance use, but we're seeing that a lot of times our kids don't have adequate means of being able to cope with the distress. Even going back to the adverse childhood experiences, they don't have the adequate means to do that. And so they are finding their way. And so things like eating disorders, where they could be restrictive, that is something that they have within their control of how to be able to manage what's happening within them. Substance use as well and the self-harm as well. Sometimes children are harming themselves as a means of finding relief and not so because they want to take their life. And so being able to, I see a lot of parents become very distressed by those things happening, which they are distressing for sure. I do not want to minimize it, but I think some of that education around some of these challenges in particular will help us as adults to be able to better support our kids. There are things that I want to be able to go into a little bit more, but I'm going to move to the next slide. So ultimately, this is about not only recognizing the challenges and concerns that we have, but how can we help? How can we support our youth? And what I have found is that the children that do have a better likelihood of coping with the challenges and showing ability to develop some resilience, have some of these things here. And so healthy connection with their parents or their caregivers, being able to feel that you can have these conversations, you can be open, honest, that people are not going to challenge or question, what the child is saying their experience is. I remember having a conversation recently with my brother about my nephew. My nephew's 13, and he was like, oh, he just talks about this and that. And then I had to realize that is what's happening in his world. So if he's talking about this and that, whatever the things are that he focuses on, anime or whatever, that is what's happening in his world. So we need to show that we're just as interested in what their experience is as they're moving through this life, as they're developing their sense of self as well. But also us having our own parents and adults and that work with our youth need to have our own healthy mental health habits to be able to model those for our kids as well. So there's something called dual regulation. If a child comes to you and they're showing signs of dysregulation, they're anxious or they're jumping from thought to thought, or they're just seeming like they're worried about things, our ability to stay calm, to co-regulate with them, to stay present in the moment with them, helps them to be able to learn how to do that for themselves. If we start to go off or start to, what's wrong, and go off the handle, right now, we're both dysregulated. And so research shows that the more regulated we are as healthy adults, that does help our children as well to be able to learn those signs and ability to regulate as well. Adequately addressing the social, racial, or economical challenges that contribute to mental health issues. I touched on it a little bit earlier. I think we have some great work to do, but I saw that we have some people in the chat with some organizations that seem to be putting a lot of effort into really trying to address some of these issues and helping our youth to develop healthy self-confidence and autonomy in a world where there is a lot of comparison, where our kids are basing themselves off of how many likes or views that they're getting on their social media. It can be really, really easy for them to develop a lot of insecurities around that. And so helping them to be able to have their own autonomy, their own way of understanding what's important for them and their world, and not basing it off of other people's perceptions, are things that ways we can help our youth to thrive. We want to start the conversation. We want to have honest, healthy communication. That can be a good start. In our family, we try to, hey, I would like to have this conversation with you. And if my nephew says, like, I don't want to talk about that right now, I say, all right, cool. But I will ask you again later if you're comfortable with that, right? So being able to have that consent, letting them know that we're interested, that we're curious, right? Instead of drawing our own conclusion about what's happening, trying to understand what is going on with them from their point of view. Model by talking about when you have your own emotions or how you've coped. So, being able to be a little bit more transparent about that. Again, not confiding in your child as if they are, your therapist, but being able to say, hey, yeah, today was tough for me too. And, this is what I want to do, or this is how we can help each other with, changing how our day is going. We want to listen first. Ask the youth how we can support them, right? Again, always using our 2 ears versus the one mouth that we have to be able to understand what's going on. And then again, looking about knowing when to get professional help. If you're noticing these signs for a couple weeks or more, it may be good to even to have bringing the child in just to at least get a screening. We have a couple screenings that we can do for mood changes, anxiety, trauma, or even getting testing for ADHD or autism if you're thinking that there's something going on there. Fred Rogers, we all love Mr. Rogers. Anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that's mentionable can be more manageable. When we can talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. Those conversations. And just a reminder that mental health is essential for our overall health, and our children deserve to have really healthy lives. If you're interested in keeping up with me and my practice, I know I've flew through this stuff, but I think paying attention and being with me on this. And I do see some people put some things in the chat, so we'll have some time for some questions afterwards as well. But you can find us at simplybeingcounseling.com or on social media by all those names as well. We post different informational psychoeducation as well on our website. So I am going to throw it over to Mallory.
That was wonderful information. I always love having the opportunity to present with people who work in the field the way Crystal does. I think there's so much that I always learn, even as someone who struggled. So my name is Mallory Gotthelf. I am a mental health public speaker with the organization Minding Your Mind. I'm going to share a little bit about Minding Your Mind, give you a brief little backstory about me, and then pass it over to my colleague, Colin, who I have the opportunity to present with today. And then we really want to open it up for questions. We want to know what you all want to know. So briefly, Minding Your Mind is a fantastic organization that's focused on opening up the conversation around mental health. Our platform to do so is through storytelling. We find that storytelling can be a really powerful way to open these conversations, to give a face to a lot of things that these kids are struggling with, and maybe they're not seeing it. When we like to go out there and tell those stories, not only to open conversation, but to break down stigma. There is stigma that still exists absolutely around mental health. As much as I'm seeing everything progress and grow, there's still a lot of work to be done there. And so we're having that opportunity to talk about these tough topics and break down that stigma and make it easier to start these conversations. And so we do that through a lot of different programming. Colin and myself work with the We Are Young Adult Speakers. We go into schools, mostly also within the community, and we share our stories as a way to open that conversation. We also have a lot of different programs. We have a program, Kind Minds, that focuses on K through fourth grade and emotional regulation there. We do things for parents and adults, educators as well. So we have a lot of different programming through Minding Your Mind. But with the young adult programming, our main goal is to tell our story. And so to give you a brief background about me, I grew up as what everyone would describe as a very bubbly kid. If you knew me, I always had a smile on my face. I have a loud voice. I grew up with two older brothers. In order to be seen and heard, I had to be louder than everyone in that room. And I surely took that message to heart. I was louder than everyone in any room. The thing was, I was kind of living a little bit of a double life. Outside, I was projecting this confident, outgoing young kid, and inside, I was battling with devastating anxiety that I really didn't have a name for either. You see, in my family as well, mental health wasn't really talked about. We didn't really talk about our feelings. I just knew I had a lot of big feelings. A lot of anxious questions would come to me at night, things about death, dying, and illness, questions I would ask my parents that were seemingly random, but were thoughts that were really plaguing me. And then anxiety over time kind of shifted. In order to help me feel like I had some control over my anxiety, I started developing this ritual of hand washing. I started developing this ritual that eventually turned into OCD, something that I really have struggled with for the entirety of my life. But it was a way for me to cope with my anxiety, to find a space to navigate my anxiety through these rituals of washing my hands repeatedly. Over time, that also shifted. While I struggled with OCD, I also found that I struggled with disordered eating. It was another way for me to find an outlet to control my anxiety. I so desperately wanted to feel like I was in control of something in my life. And through these different rituals and through controlling my food, I was finding ways to navigate my mental health challenges. The problem was those techniques are not actually very effective in managing your mental health. And so as the more I started to progress through this, the more I realized I didn't really like who I was. I felt shame in me trying to manage my mental health in this way. And I always like to say, what goes up must come down. And so my anxiety was rising, rising, rising all through my childhood. And by the time I hit high school, it kind of crashed and culminated in this depression. I didn't have language for depression either, but all I knew was that every day felt like a struggle. Every day felt like it was just another day I had to get through. I did my best to mask my pain with my big smile. I did my best to show up and do well in my classes because I had ambitions. The problem was that mask became heavier and heavier for me to put on. It became more difficult to fake how I was feeling. And so I also fell into that trap of I need to find a way to control what's going on. What do I do next? And I found myself struggling with self harm. It was a way for me to make that invisible pain something I could see and point to say, this hurts. I wanted a way to express that pain. The problem was, instead of asking for the help that I needed, I found myself going back to these coping mechanisms because I was ashamed. I didn't want to ask for help because I didn't want people to look at me differently. I grew up as a competitive athlete. It was tough it out, it was keep going. And that mentality was something I took into consideration for my mental health, but it wasn't working. And so the more things started to progress, the more depressed I became, the harder it was for me to maintain this facade that I was okay. And then I started struggling with the suicidal thoughts. And that was that moment where I really didn't know how my life was going to go. I really just wasn't sure if there was anything left worth doing for me. And so I started struggling with suicidal thoughts because I needed to know I had a way out from all of this pain, all of these things that I didn't know how to manage, all of this stuff that I was navigating on my own. And it wasn't until someone in my high school, someone who I didn't know super well, but I went to a small high school, so we all knew each other relatively well. She had reached out and said she had struggled the year before. And if I wanted to talk, she would listen. And after kind of blowing her off a couple times, she said, I'm really here, I promise, whatever you want to talk about. And eventually I said, I really need to let you know what's going on. Maddie became my lifeline for many months, and she was the one who helped me navigate what I was struggling with. But at some point, she knew that my life was at risk, that I wasn't safe. And so she, on Christmas Day during my sophomore year of high school, reached out to my parents and said, Mallory is struggling with suicidal ideation, and she really needs some help. That moment changed the course of my life. It was the first time that I realized that it was okay to talk about these issues, that they weren't always going to be met with judgment and shame. It was the first time that I realized there was treatment, not just for physical health, but also for mental health, that I could go out there and receive the treatment that I needed. It was the first time that I realized that I'm a whole person outside of just my struggles, but in order to live my life fully, I needed to make sure I took care of my symptoms too. It was the first time that I heard someone say, your mental health challenges are just like diabetes. You can still go out there and live a full and meaningful life. You're just going to need to manage your symptoms and be aware of everything that's going on. That moment changed everything for me. Now, that's not to say the story was easy moving forward, but I learned that I could receive treatment. I learned that I was able to move forward in my life. And while other things kind of occurred and happened, what really was the big change for me was knowing that I was able to advocate for myself in those situations. I learned that I didn't need to be afraid to talk about my mental health. If there was something going on, I was allowed to say it. And maybe I wouldn't always be met with positivity, but I would find someone who would understand. And so in that time, I really dug into that recovery process. It was the moment that I realized I was allowed to take care of myself and there were options out there for people who were struggling with their mental health. The journey has been a long, winding road, and that's not to say I don't still struggle today, but I've learned the tools and skills to help me navigate those things. And I've learned that the biggest first step thing that I always leave kids with when I walk out of these presentations is that it's okay to ask for help. And before I hand it over to Colin, I'll leave it with the thing my brother says that I love more than anything. He says, I go to the gym to work out and get physically strong, and I go to therapy to work out to get mentally strong. And I love that concept because it reminds us that talking to people and reaching out for help, it's not a weakness, helps us learn and grow and be the best version of ourselves. So I always encourage the youth to go out and ask those questions, reach out to their support systems and get the help that they need so they can feel the best that they can. And I'm going to pass it over to Colin so he can share a little bit about his story with you all too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mallory. And thank you, Crystal. Thank you guys for sharing. It's gonna be tough to follow up, but I'm gonna do my best. So my name is Colin. Like Mallory said, I work for an organization called Minding Your Mind. I'm a young adult speaker. And just to get right into it, I grew up in a small town in River Edge, New Jersey, just about 15, 20 minutes outside of New York City. And I have two incredible parents. They worked your regular 9 to 5 jobs while my siblings and I went to school, went to our extracurricular activities. And the way I describe my childhood and into my adolescent years was it looked like the perfect life. And entering middle school, I didn't really know what mental health was, to be honest. I knew that some days felt long, other days I felt sad, but whenever a problem came up or a circumstance or a feeling came up that I didn't really like, I would tell myself that, I'm fine, I don't need any help, and I'll get over it later. One thing I did know though in middle school was that I was an athlete. At the time, participated in football, basketball, and baseball. There was always a practice, a game, a workout to go to in sports. It gave me a place where I truly wanted to be. Somewhere where I can be myself and let go of everything on the outside. And think about in my household, my parents argued and they argued a lot. And when I say a lot, I mean just about every day. And my siblings, they're quiet, shy, didn't say much, kept to themselves. Me, on the other hand, I was a little bit like Mallory in a sense. I was always loud, I was outgoing, I was always cracking jokes, and I always kind of wanted to be the center of attention. So an argument would start between my parents and my siblings. They would kind of just step to the side, and that would leave me. And I felt like I had to step into the middle of my parents' arguments just to get it to stop. I felt like I had to be some sort of mediator, some sort of middleman between my parents. And was I ready to fulfill that role in my family? Absolutely not. I was just a little kid. Did I want to fulfill that role in my family? Again, absolutely not. I was just a little kid. Entering high school, I kind of had one thing on my mind and one thing only. I wanted to be the cool kid. I wanted to be the most popular kid, the most talked about kid. And I kind of wanted to establish myself in the top of that dumb social hierarchy that comes with being in high school. At the time, I didn't know any better. And I was just trying to make the people around me, like my family, my friends, and my siblings happy. And I thought this was the way to do it. And, my freshman year came and went, and then it was my sophomore year of high school. At this point, I was a varsity athlete on football, basketball, and baseball. And the way when I talk to kids, I always say, that nervous feeling, that little pit you might get in your stomach for a big game, a big test, or a big quiz. For us adults, maybe it's a big meeting or whatever it is. I'd get that feeling just like any other kid before my games. But then I'd get that feeling again, and this time after my games, and this time just to go out with my friends. Think about me when I went out in high school. I always wanted to drink the most. Always wanted everyone to laugh at my jokes, and I always wanted to have my girlfriend nearby. I wanted everyone to look at me and want to be me when deep down, I didn't even want to be me. But life continued. And then, just like everyone else, my life changed forever in the March of 2020 when the coronavirus pandemic hit the earth. All those distractions that had kept me from my mental health for so long were gone. Here I am, not allowed out to see my friends, not allowed at school to see my friends, not allowed at sports, not allowed to hang out with my girlfriend. When you think about it, guys, I'm really nowhere. I was kind of just stuck in my house to sit with my feelings and sit with my negative thoughts. And then, a few weeks later, it was the beginning of April, a few weeks into the lockdown, we were all stuck in our house, if you guys remember. And I was in my basement. I was, playing video games with my buddy, just like any other kid, probably like 2, 3 a.m. And we logged off. And I'm sitting in my basement. And all of a sudden, my hands started shaking. My chest got tight. My heart started beating really fast. And I didn't know what was happening to me. But just like in middle school, when, days felt long or I felt sad, I told myself that I'm fine. I don't need any help and I'll get over it myself. But then all of a sudden, I ran up my basement stairs. And then I got to my kitchen. I kind of just froze. And it was in that moment that I don't know what I was looking for, but I was just looking for a way to make the pain go away. Fortunately, I don't know if he heard me downstairs or he needed a glass of water, but my dad came downstairs that night. And I remember standing at one end of the kitchen looking down at my dad, and he didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. And I ran over to him and I jumped in his arms and I started crying like a little kid, apologizing, saying, I'm sorry, Dad, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. And this is when things kind of started to go downhill. And this is when my depression really came to life. The way I like to describe it is, every day I would wake up and I would walk around and, I'd live my life as if there was this invisible backpack on top of my shoulders. And that backpack was filled with invisible rocks. And eventually that weight, it just became too much. But after that night, where I saw my dad downstairs, I apologized and we kind of knew it was time to get some help. And my parents, they got me in contact with a therapist that I started talking to once a week virtually, then got me in contact with a psychiatrist that I started talking to about every other week. And that psychiatrist prescribed me antidepressant medication. And at the time, I didn't know that there was nothing wrong with being on a medication for a mental health issue. I thought I was weird because of the medication. I thought I was different from the other kids that didn't need the medication. And at the time, there were, three big barriers that I put up that really prevented me from healing. The first for my parents. At the time they were going through a divorce, and I just didn't want to be that extra burden in their lives. The second, just this continuous cycle that I'd been living since I was a little kid that, whenever a problem came up, just me telling myself that, it's fine, I got it under control. I don't need any help. And the third, and probably the biggest, was other people. As we all know, being a teenager in the modern world, it's a very difficult thing. I was always wondering about, what other people had, what other people were doing, what other people talked about me, what they said. My whole life I built this image that I'm this big, strong, invincible athlete, this big, strong, invincible man. I was terrified of that image being tarnished. And, virtual school at this point was a thing. I would sleep through every single class, through every single day. I'd set alarms at the beginning and at the end of each period. Growing up, I liked being in school. I liked learning. I liked seeing my friends' faces, even if it just meant, on a little box in the corner of my computer. But again, I just couldn't handle that pressure that came with being awake. My social anxiety that I talked about, after my football games turned to a constant anxiety. I couldn't go 5 minutes. And when I say 5 minutes, I really mean 5 minutes, without thinking what was going to happen next or what was going to happen next after that. And truthfully, whether or not I was going to live to see the next day or not. Fast forward my senior year of high school, I just been continue living this unhealthy life, this unhealthy cycle that I've been living every single day. November 2021, I'm going to college in less than a year. I still got that big group of friends that's running my entire life. Still got the girlfriend. It still looks like this perfect life. And I woke up one day, it was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. It was 24 hours before I'm about to see, my family, my friends, the people that love and care about me, the people that I love and care about. I woke up that day and something felt different. I just wanted to make the pain go away once and for all. At this point, like I said, I had my license. I drove my car to what's called the Alpine Lookout, which is part of the Palisades Cliffs in North Jersey. Palisades Cliffs, it's a tourist attraction. It's truly a place of beauty, a place that people come across the globe just to see. But me, I didn't see any of that beauty. All I saw was a place to make the pain go away. So I got there, parked my car, put my keys in the cup holder because there was no intention of driving home that day. Opened the door, closed the door, started walking towards the edge of the cliff and started walking towards the end of my life. And I got there, I sat down, and I waited for a bit, and I waited for a bit, and then I finally said to myself, 10 seconds. If you don't get a sign in the next 10 seconds, that's it. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. It was a cloudy day that day. And all of a sudden, the clouds, they started separating from themselves, I heard a voice inside of me. It wasn't a real voice, a voice that I hadn't heard in a really long time, since probably middle school. A voice telling me that you can be someone strong. You can be someone who leads a motivated, disciplined, and successful life, and that I deserve that life. And a voice telling me that not only can you not do this to your family and your friends, the people that love and care about you, most importantly, you cannot do this to yourself. And I heard that voice and I jumped back. And that voice saved my life. And to me, that was the voice of hope. And personally, I believe hope relies within each and every one of us. And I believe hope is the reason that we are all here today, the hope to make this world a better place. And, that's something I try and live by every single day of my life. And, when I think of life, I like to think of life like this mountain, kind of like this never-ending mountain of life. And for me, there's no such thing as going backwards on the mountain of life. Because even when I make mistakes or I mess up or I fail, that's okay, because I'm a human being. And I think that's something that, we need to really prioritize, with our teens and with our adolescents and our kids. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to mess up. You're going to fail. And that's okay. And I make mistakes every single day of my life. And just knowing that that's okay, it helps me accept it, helps me understand it, and helps me learn from it. So, I always like to try and think of like this big ending as a speaker, but, I'm going to keep this one simple today. One, I want to thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys for, joining this webinar, because it shows that you care about this battle against mental health every single day. But also just thank you for being on this earth, because sometimes when I'm going through a little rough patch, all I need is someone to say to me, I'm glad you're here. So thank you guys. I appreciate your attention, your respect. And like I said, I appreciate you guys joining this webinar. I'm going to pass it back to our great facilitator, Crystal, and I think we're going to get started on a little Q&A.
Thank you, Mallory and Kyle. I think you both really encompass a lot of what my presentation showcased of, how challenging it could be to not only know the signs and the symptoms, but to get that support from not the people in our lives, our friends, and being able to open up the conversations because, like in Mallory's case, someone was willing to share their experience with you. And shared connections is something that really does help us, I think, to open up, to heal, and to be able to just see so much progress with this. I do see that for the sake of time, we probably won't have too much with some questions. I was trying to address some things in the chat that I saw people posted, so thank you. But what I would like to know is, you talked a little bit about how the adults showed up for you, being able to kind of, for you. What do you think was most pivotal about how they approached, helping you and healing from your challenges that was going on? I don't know
Chat,
who
you
wants to
want me?
take it.
I'll
Colin,
I'll
okay.
take it. I'll take it first, and then I can hand it over to Matt. I think there were two big things that I really want to highlight that adults kind of, portrayed on me in my life. The first, whenever, kind of my parents approached me about, my mental health, my depression, my anxiety, whatever it was, the first thing they said to me was, I'm having this conversation with you. I'm sitting down with you today because I care about you. And just hearing that someone cares about me and hearing that they're coming from a place of love, that just made me feel welcomed. And it kind of created that, what I like to call, safe haven of conversation, this little, invisible circle that, I kind of had within my parents. And then the second thing, which I think is also super important, I think Crystal, you touched on a little bit before, was asking those open-ended questions. Because I feel like when we're talking to, for me, when someone was talking to me when I was really going through a lot, whether it was, depression or anxiety, using those words, are you feeling depressed today? Are you having some anxiety? It can almost feel like, you're under siege a little bit as a teen. So I think asking open-ended questions, how are you feeling today? How do you feel about that? I think asking those open-ended questions, listening, and then after they answer, I think the first thing we always gotta say is, thank you for sharing that with me. That took a lot of bravery, a lot of courage for you to say that, and I really appreciate that. I think those are the two biggest things for me that I felt were helpful when it came to talking to adults as a kid.
Yeah, that's great. And the thing I'll add to it is something else that Crystal mentioned earlier, which is sometimes that first time when you say, I would love to sit down and talk to you about this thing, and you're like, no, I don't want to talk about that right now. But knowing that you can come back later. And one thing that I'll say that my dad did for me that I found really beneficial, and I tell this story quite a bit, is when I was in the hospital, he said the only time I ever engaged with the other patients was when we were playing a game of Uno, which really tracks with my personality. I'm unbearably competitive. And so he was like, it was like I knew a part of you was still there. And so when I was, I left the hospital, he bought an Uno deck for us, and he would sit down with me every night and play. He didn't ask me to talk to him. He didn't say we had to talk about my mental health, but this was his way of giving me a space that if I wanted to talk, I was allowed to. I had an open space to. And if I didn't, let's just spend time together and let's connect. And this was an easier way for us to open up conversation where it wasn't like we have to make direct eye contact with one another and talk about all the things. It was just a space where we could connect. And if I wanted to talk, I was there. And we were also doing something. So it made it a little bit less uncomfortable to have that conversation. I always like to tell people sometimes it's you go for a walk or you go for a drive where you're not directly looking at that person. Sometimes you have the best conversations because it feels like less of a barrier when you're in those situations doing something to bring that conversation forward. And I found the adults in my life really stepped up in a lot of ways of creating that space without making it feel like a pressure cooker. But yeah, Colin's were excellent. And I agree with those as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen that as well with my nephew, of just being, honoring if it's not the right time, right? Because I think sometimes we can come off with the inquisition and like it's an interrogation, right? But we don't want to do that. We want to be able to make it so it's an open space so that they're wanting to have that communication with us. Because really it's their business, right? It was your business of what was going on, but it was important to be able to understand that there was a healthy space to share it in your life. We have a question, and I don't know if I might need some more clarification for it, but Warren asked, how do you engage with the culture youth interact with and communicate the positive and toxic sides of it? how do you engage with the culture youth interact with and communicate the positive and toxic sides of it? It looks like he said, yes, how do you engage with culture without compromising to better affect change in their youth? People come from all different backgrounds, right? And there are, I think, kind of going back to how um, going back to how racism affects, somebody mentioned earlier, weathering, like the chronic stress that a person who experiences racism may feel, that kind of becomes a normal process of our everyday life. And I don't know any Black person on this earth that I can say doesn't know what a visceral reaction to being in a situation, whether it's with a very overt racism or discrimination, right? We know, I say we have a physical response to it. So I think being able to recognize that there are things that happen as part of the culture individually, um, and understanding how that impacts not only our connections together, but also our individual reactions to certain experiences. But I think that it's important to, if I'm understanding correctly, and you can tell me if I'm not answering, or Mallory or Colin, if you have another perspective that you can add, then please add it in. But the question is, how do you engage with culture without compromising it to affect a better change in youth?
I think for me personally, whenever I'm working with kids or talking to kids, whether that's, presentation with 500 kids in it, or I'm talking one-on-one with kid after a presentation, I think the biggest thing that I try and stress onto, teens and, kind of, because like I said during, my story, being a teen, it's hard. There's a lot of pressures. There's a lot going on. It's almost like, life is like so sped up. You don't really know what's going on. So I think the biggest thing that I try and stress to them is providing the information. What can they do if they are feeling a certain way? And when it comes to, their culture and just, how to deal with other kids and, how to deal with the social pressures that come with being an adolescent, one of the biggest things I like to tell them is, control what you can control. At the end of the day, all we can do is control our actions, control what we say, and control what we do. We can't control what other people do. We can't control what other people say. So I think, providing them with the information that they need, where they feel safe and they know where to go if they are feeling a certain way, and then also controlling what they can control in their their teenage environment, so to say, whether that's school or out on the playground or in the park or whatever it is, just controlling what they can control.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin. Finally, I wanted to ask if you had any lasting comments on people who may be struggling with their mental health.
I'll go first, Mallory, then I'll hand it over to you. I think the biggest thing for me is that you're never alone. And it's it sounds simple, and you might have heard it before. It might sound like a cliche, but it's really the truth, and it's the reality. You are never alone. There's always someone that has been through what you went through, going through what you went through, and you're never alone. And the stigma, as much as it might feel real, and you might feel that fear, I promise you, the first time you speak up, it's gonna feel like this weight, this pressure is just lifted off your shoulders. And the second time you have the conversation about mental health, it's a little bit easier than the first time. The third time's a little bit easier than the second time, and so on and so forth. So that's the two biggest things for me, and I'll pass it over to Melanie.
It's beautiful. I love that. I know this is going to kind of sound silly, but there's no stupid reason to keep living. I think a lot of times we feel like we don't have a purpose, or that we're a burden, or that we're struggling and it's too much. And there's so much hope out there. And I think we can get really caught in the negativity. I mean, like, I think about doom scrolling a lot, or the news cycle that is horrifying every single day. And it can feel overwhelming, especially for young people not being able to take it. It's hard for them to take breaks from this stuff. It's hard for them to step back and think about these things based on where they are in their life. And there's no bad reason to keep going. always like to remind kids, whether it's you're excited for your favorite TV show to drop another season, or you want to hang out with your dog a little bit more, or you're excited because you have a dance coming up. Like, there's no bad reason to keep going. There's always something to hold on to. And whatever that is for you, keep holding on to it. It doesn't matter what it is, hold that tight, because that's going to be the thing that gives you that first step forward and then that next step forward. And it helps you kind of snowball into this place where you've found hope again. And so whatever that little thing is that you need to hold on to, hold on tight, because that's going to be the thing that keeps you going even during dark times. There's always something beautiful out there worth fighting for, and your life is always going to be meaningful. Everybody has a purpose here. And I truly believe that. And that's the thing I like them to hold on to, especially in moments of darkness.
Thank you. I think that's very powerful. Just knowing what is within your control, what can you hold on to hope to, what are the things that you understand keep you here, whether there's no stupid reason for that. So I appreciate you all for sharing. I'm so, again, thankful for the opportunity to share my perspective as a human with my experiences learning how to parent a teenager as well. And thank you all for contributing in the chat.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you, Mallory and Colin, for sharing your stories. We really appreciate you doing this mental health advocacy. And thank you, Crystal, for everything that you're doing. Thank you for being a speaker with us, but also for everything that you're doing in your practice. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Please be on the lookout for a follow-up email from us. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you're interested in receiving individualized capacity building assistance and training. Thank you.